everyone, welcome back to another tutorial video where I'm going to be painting this stag and giving some tips on how you can go about creating something similar. Also, this piece is available on my Etsy store and I'll leave a link to that in the description. And if you want to follow along with me and draw something like this at your own pace in real time, then I've got all of the real-time tutorials for this painting over on my Patreon. So again, you can get up to 15 real-time tutorials a month for just $5 on there. So again, I'll leave a link to that at the top of the description as well. But let's get on with today's tutorial. So all of the materials that I'm using are listed in the description below if you want to check them out, but you can get a similar result to this without using my exact materials, but you can check them out to see what kind of stuff that I like to use. So the first thing that I'm doing is I'm taking a black inktense pencil, but you can use black watercolor if you want, and I'm just blocking in the darkest parts of this stag. So I am using a reference photo, and especially if you want to do something that is kind of semi-realistic or realistic, you'll need to use a reference photo unless you've done it a lot of times before that you know what the anatomy is like and all of the different details. But there is no shame in using a reference photo, and it's something that I really recommend. So like I said, I took that pencil, I made sure it was really sharp, and I just shaded in the areas that were going to be really dark. So with this inktense pencil, once you add water, it goes really dark and really pigmented. So you don't need to layer too much pencil down onto the actual paper. Also, when I laid down the pencil, I tried to keep it quite smooth so that I don't get a grainy look once I go in with the water. So once I covered the whole area with the pencil, what I'm doing now is I'm going in with the Pentel water brush pen with a bit of water on it, and I just blended all of that out to give me a base area so I knew where all of the shadows were. So once I've established the shadows and the base, I'm going in with some watercolors now with my Daler Rowney Aquafine paintbrushes, and I'm first starting off with the basic brown. So I like to pick a base tone for the whole of the animal, which in this case the stag is brown. So I went in with the brown watercolor, and I'm just using different size paintbrushes depending on the area that I'm painting, and I'm just adding certain concentrations to the different areas. Some areas I'm just doing a really light wash, and in other areas like now I'm adding a bit more of a saturated, thicker paint to those areas. I like to paint stuff wet on wet so that it kind of flows into each other and you get this nice natural look where the colours sort of merge and you can get some really nice gradients. So if you want to get gradients and kind of soft transitions across areas, then it's really good to use the wet and wet method. If you use the wet on dry method, then you get more of sharp edges and more of a sharp look without those softer gradients. So I'm continuing to take that thicker paint on my paintbrush, and I'm just layering up those different shadow tones. What's really good is that in the first stage, I did the black kind of base layer, which means that I know where the shadows are when I'm going over the top with this brown watercolor, and I can just kind of follow that. So one little technique that I'm doing now is if you want to remove any of the watercolor from a certain area just to lighten it up, then I get my paintbrush, I make sure it's clean and got some water on it, and then I just kind of dab the paintbrush on that area and push it upwards, and this helps to lift some of that watercolor off, but this only works if it's already wet. So if it's dry, then you won't really get much of a good result with that technique. So that's why I like to do everything when it's wet on wet. I find that gives you the best sort of result. So now that I've established all of the brown tones, I'm going in with some darker brown and some black, and I just created some even more darker shadows. So now what I'm doing is I'm taking that inktense pencil once again, and I'm just using that to darken up the black tones. So I do like to start off with a light wash and then build it up to darker shadows over time as I go. This helps give me more kind of control over it so I don't go too dark too soon. So like I said, I'm just continuing with that inktense pencil, and I'm darkening up each area as I go. I'm either applying the pencil directly onto the area and blending it with the water, or I'm kind of touching the paintbrush onto the actual pencil and I'm using the ink in that way. And like I said, you don't have to use the inktense pencil. You can use black watercolor if you want. The only reason that I'm not using black watercolor is because I ran out of it and I'm waiting for it to be kind of delivered to my house. But yeah, black watercolor is what I would normally use. So I'm also adding some more shadows to the fur. This isn't meant to be really realistic, but I do want the anatomy and all of the shadows to be correct. So that's why I'm still using a reference photo, because I need to see where the shadows are so I can get a really good contrast with the animal. I'm also darkening up the nose, so I'm just applying that Inktense pencil to the brush and then I apply that straight onto the painting. And what I noticed about the Inktense pencils is that it looks quite dark when it's wet, but then when it dries to more of a grayer tone rather than being black. And that happens a lot with all watercolors, so it will always look more saturated and darker when it's wet. So you've got to kind of imagine that it's going to be lighter and less sort of vibrant when it's dry to get a visualization of how it's going to look when it's dry. So one thing that you might want to do is you might want to let it all dry between layers, especially if you don't want colours to bleed into other areas. If you're working wet on wet, the more water you have, the less control you have of where that watercolour is going to flow. So if you have more watercolour down, then it means that the colours will bleed more and you might lose some of that sort of intensity because all the colours will just merge together. So you don't want to use too much unless you are going for that kind of messy, all flowing together kind of look. So again, I wait for that to dry and going in with another layer of the brown, just building up that intensity. This helps to add depth and I like the look of lots of different layers on top of each other. I think it looks a lot more interesting and I just like that look. So here's a technique that I like to use to blur out certain areas. So I don't like to keep everything within the outline. Sometimes I go in with a clean wet brush, I apply a bit of water to like an outside edge of a certain element like I did with the ear, and then I try to bleed some of the colour from the ear into the background. And this helps give another bit of interesting area to the painting, and it also is just something that makes it less sort of rigid. So now I'm going on to painting the antlers, and what I did first was I applied the brown layer to the darkest areas of the antlers, and then I used the clean wet brush to kind of blend that out towards the lighter areas. And then I'm just going to go in with even more tones of brown, and I'm going to create some little markings on the antlers. So it's not just one shade, I'm going to add all of the little individual kind of markings in the antlers with some different browns and also some blacks later on. And again, you want these to look three-dimensional. So the way that you achieve something looking three-dimensional with watercolors is that, again, you need to get your shadows and your highlights in. There will be certain areas of the paper that you might just want to leave white, and this really helps make it pop and give it that contrast. And again, there's certain areas that you'll want to make quite dark. You might even want to hype up the saturation and the contrast of your reference photo to make it pop even more and make for more of an appealing sort of painting. So the style that I was going for here is something just quite loose. I want it to look like the animal, but I'm not going for photorealism. So when you're doing this style, it's not about getting every single detail in. It's more about getting sort of the impression and making it look like that animal. So having all of the essential pieces so it looks like the animal, so the anatomy, and everything like that needs to be similar, and then you can kind of do a looser style. You just want to get the basics in, kind of like the essence of the animal down. So the way it moves, maybe the expression. Again, you can see on that antler, again, I faded that into the background a bit, so it's blurry in certain areas. I don't want everything perfectly outlined, and certain areas as well I'm leaving lighter so they fade more into the background, and then other areas will be darker. And again, it's because I don't want everything to look the same across this watercolor piece. I want to make it look a bit more interesting. So now I'm working on the body, and I'm doing this in the same method. I'm going in slowly adding more and more of the brown tones. As you can see, I use that technique again to remove some of the watercolor by pushing that clean paintbrush upwards, and this helps lift off that watercolor. And one thing I always like to do with my watercolor pieces is add some sort of splatters and drips to the background. I think this makes it look really, really interesting and just makes it look even looser. So the color scheme that I chose for this piece was brown and pink. So from the start, I always had the idea that I wanted to do this using brown and pink. And I'm going to be doing a video about color theory and how you can pick really nice harmonious colours for your work. So what I'm going to be doing is a video on that really soon, because it is something that can be quite difficult and I think a lot of people find that useful. But what I decided to do was get the base tone of brown in first and then add splashes of pink over the top. And I always like to use the most common, the most colour that I'm going to be using, so the major colour first, and get all of that in, and then I add splashes of the other colours to kind of complement it. Once I got everything established, I'm just going in with even darker browns and blacks, and I'm just making sure that that contrast is perfect before I go in with the fine liner. So as you can see, I'm adding some really dark markings to those antlers now. And even though they look really dark, remember when they dry, they will dry lighter. I'm darkening up the eyes as well and some of the ears. And I've got the reference photo in front of me at all times. And what's important is that you keep looking at your reference photo. You don't just look at it once and then don't look at it again. You've got to be looking at it throughout every part of the process to make sure that you're staying on the right sort of path. So with these drips, I would normally tilt the paper instead of kind of drawing them on myself, because you'll get more of a natural look that way, and it can make it look a bit sort of rigid and fake when you paint them on yourself. But the reason that I didn't tilt the paper is because this is quite a large piece. It's 12 by 16, so I had to tape it to my drawing surface, which is all sort of like, there's no way I could lift the surface, and I didn't want to remove all of the tape because everything's wet, so I didn't want it to warp. So I wanted to keep it taped down, so I just decided that I'd paint the drips on. And what I like to try and do is make them different widths as you go down the drip, because the drip might kind of be thin in certain areas and then go thicker towards the end. So if you want to paint your own drips on, then you could look at reference photos of drips to see how they sort of behave naturally, and then you can replicate that. Okay, so now that I'm completely done with all of the watercolour stage, I'm going in with some fine liners. So these are the Faber-Castell pit liners. And what I'm doing is I'm creating sort of an illustrative style. So I just want to outline certain things, make things a bit more defined, and just make it look a bit more interesting. What I really like to do in this style is add some little like scribbles and loose lines all over the place. And this is just my sort of preference. There's no like particular reasons why you need to do this. I just really like doing that, and I really like the way it looks. But the main thing that I like to do about this is I just like to crispen up all of the edges and add certain details. So for example, if I wanted to add more detail to the fur, I do that with this technique. I don't try to add every little strand of fur using watercolours, but I do go in with the pen and add sort of the direction and an impression of the fur and the direction that it's going in. As you can see around sort of between the eyes, you can see I've done some little pen markings. So you can just see that it defines everything, gives a bit more structure to it, and it just makes everything a bit more clarified. So what I like to do is I like to start off with the sort of smallest, finest nib pen, so like the extra small I'm using, and then I work my way up to using the larger, thicker nibs until I get to like the brush pens, and I use that for the boldest outlines. So all of the detail I'm just doing with this really small pen, and then for the main outlines like on the antlers, around the body and the neck and stuff like that, I'll use with a bolder pen. And this variety in the thickness of the lines helps add depth and dimension to your painting. And again, this is just something that I really like for this style. I like to add varying different lines. I think it makes it look a lot more interesting. So I'm just continuing to do that throughout the entire piece. I'm still looking at the reference photo, and what I like to do is jump around quite a lot when I'm doing that. So I don't like work in one place and then go throughout the piece in a sort of order. I like to just jump around with it. So now I'm going in with some white gouache, and I like using the white gouache because it's quite opaque, and you can even get something looking quite translucent if you want, but you've got that option to go really opaque with it as well. So what I'm doing is I'm using my smaller paintbrush, so quite a fine paintbrush, so I can get some little details And I'm just using quite a thick sort of consistency of the white gouache, and the white gouache is by Winsor & Newton, and I'm just creating some little details. So for example, you can see I've created some little fur marks and fur strokes inside the ears, and also some details on the antlers. I also use that for highlighted areas or areas in the reference photo that are a lot lighter than my painting is. So for example, around the eyes, that area has got a bit too dark with the watercolors. So I'm just going in with this white gouache and I'm lightening that up. But I like to leave the gouache stage to the last sort of thing that I want to do, because I find that if you add watercolors over the top, you don't get that same look that you would if you didn't use the gouache. So you can't really go over the gouache with the watercolor. It'll still give you that gouache sort of feel. It won't react and act like watercolors anymore if it's on top of the gouache. So I'm just creating some of the brighter highlights in the eyes, and I'm adding more water if I want sort of a translucent look. So I'm just working my way around. When I did this, I wanted to work from the top to the bottom so that I wasn't smudging and getting my hand all smearing the paint. So like I said, when I did the fine liners, I just jumped around because it doesn't really matter. There's nothing really wet. But with paint, I like to work from the top to the bottom so that I can sort of limit the amount that I'm smudging and kind of moving all of the paint around. But this stuff does dry quite quickly, I've found. So it's not too bad. Obviously, the thicker layer you apply, the longer it takes to dry. Another thing you'll notice about the gouache is that when you apply the gouache, it will look really white and really vibrant. And when it actually dries, it's a lot more translucent. It's not as opaque. So one thing you've also got to get in your mind is that it will dry a lot more translucent than it looks when it's wet. So you might think you've got something really bright and a really bright highlight, but in reality, when it dries, it will just be like this slightly grayish, lighter tone. So you might have to keep layering. But again, it's not really a problem because you can just add a thicker layer on top if you need to. So one of the final things that I like to do is just go in with that white gouache and create some little splatters. I find that this gives it quite a like magical look, and I really just like adding little splatters. I think it adds more interest, and I really like it for this style. But again, I'm just going in and making the final touches. If you want to do splatters, then the larger paintbrush you use, the bigger sort of droplets you'll get. So if you want just really small, like kind of little speckles of it, then you can use smaller paintbrushes. But if you want big sort of dollops, like I'm doing now, I'm switching over to the larger paintbrushes. So the final thing that I quickly did was I just went in with some Faber-Castell polychromos and just used them to hype up the saturation on some of the pink areas. And like I said, I'm going in with this brush pen, so the fine liner, but this is the biggest one that I have, and I'm using that to darken up the main elements like the nose, and I'll use it to add some thicker lines. And this again gives another level of kind of depth and dimension. Again, I'm just looking at the reference photo to figure out where I need to add this. So it's just mainly to the darkest areas and outlining certain things like the antlers. So as you can see, I used loads of different mediums when I did this. I used watercolors, pencils, gouache, pens, and all of that sort of stuff, even inktense and white gel pen. So I really like using lots of different mediums, but that's basically it for this. As I said, you can get prints of this in a few different sizes available on my Etsy store, and I'll link that in the description. And also remember that if you are a patron or want to become a patron, then I've got this along with 3 other real-time large animal painting tutorials on there, so you can follow along at your own pace and draw along with me and also get critiques on your work. But that's it for today's tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it. If you're new to my channel and you like this video, then please hit that subscribe button and tick that bell icon to get notified on my future videos, and I will see you next time. Bye everyone.